Hi everyone, and welcome to Axel's Classics, a podcast about amazing classical music. Maybe you love the genre, but you would like to learn more about the background of the pieces, or maybe you don't know any classical music at all, and you're just looking for a place to start. Well, you've definitely come to the right place, and I hope that together we can enjoy some beautiful music. Johannes Brahms, a German composer in the Romantic style period. Maybe you remember that last week I talked about different style periods in music. There's classicism, romanticism, modernism, etc. And Brahms lived in the 19th century and he composed in the second half of that century. So he was a central figure in the Romantic period in music. Another central figure, who actually died a few years before Brahms was born, is Beethoven. I'm saying this because Brahms sometimes got compared to Beethoven. Brahms' first symphony has even been nicknamed Beethoven's 10th Symphony, because the style was seen as a kind of continuation of Beethoven's symphonic style. Now, when we think about operas and symphonies, nowadays we call that classical music in general. But back then, those two used to be very different genres. Brahms wrote symphonic music, or as we call absolute music, meaning music for the sake of music, not to tell a story. On the other hand, there's a famous composer, Wagner, for example, who wrote operas, and we call that program music, meaning music that tells a story. In this episode and the next one, we kind of break away from the style of the two previous episodes, and we take a look at two overtures written by Johannes Brahms in the same year, 1880. And they are both examples of this absolute music that doesn't tell a story. The composer himself told about these overtures that one smiles while the other one weeps, meaning that there is a festival overture, a happy one, and also a tragic overture. This episode is about the tragic one. Let's listen. When we don't have a story in a piece, there has to be some kind of form, a frame for the composer to work in. And in this case, it's called the sonata form. Maybe you've heard this name before. I honestly don't like getting too theoretical, but it will really help to understand the piece much better. A sonata has basically three main sections: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. Also, at the very beginning, there's sometimes an introduction, and at the very end, a coda. But those are optional. In this case, the tragic overture, we just started listening to the exposition, which is basically a way to introduce the themes and the melodies that will be used also later in the piece. The very beginning is already interesting. It starts with two strong chords, striking like a hammer. And believe it or not, there is already a link to Beethoven. These are the same two chords as the introduction of Beethoven's 9th Symphony. But why do these sound so strong? Why do these two chords have such an impact on us as a listener? Well, in almost any kind of music, so not just classical, there are two elements. There is tension and there is release. It's basically what keeps the music so interesting, what keeps us listening. If there is too much tension for too long, then the music becomes heavy and more difficult to listen to. That's why, for example, music by Shostakovich can be less accessible than music by Mozart. Now, if we constantly get the opposite, this constant gratifying feeling of release, then the music becomes boring. It's too simple. So this balance between tension and release is what keeps us interested. The most basic way to end a musical phrase happens with two chords: the dominant chord, which is the chord that creates the most tension, and the tonic chord, which we consider the home base, creating release, breathing room. And those are the two chords that you hear at the beginning of the overture. It is the most fundamental principle in music stripped down to the bare minimum. Now, we've already heard the first theme, let's listen to the second one. Another thing that makes this music so interesting is what Brahms does with those notes. When we don't have a storyline to follow, the music itself becomes so important. And of course there are the themes that we just heard, the melodies. But the bass lines are just as important. Or maybe there is a second or a third melody being played at the same time, in different layers. So there's just always something to catch our attention, and Brahms is an absolute master at this. Let's listen to the next part, which is a kind of transition, and it contains material from the first and the second theme. But, very important, listen to the constant variations and what happens in all the layers of the music. It's difficult to catch everything immediately, so that's why I think it's fun to keep discovering things when I listen to these pieces. And the two loud hammer strikes are back. The exposition is over and we continue to the next section, the development. And this is a great section to talk about a very widely used composition technique, counterpoint, which basically means that two or more melodic lines exist at the same time. It's a bit in the name, counter, so one melody counters another. And of course it has to fit within a structure based on certain rules. I think the best example of counterpoint is a piece that I'm sure we all know, the famous Canon by Pachelbel. It starts with a very simple bass melody. Then a second melody, a second layer, gets added on top of the bass line. Then a melody starts which goes twice as fast. Then another one, again doubling the speed. And eventually an even faster melody line on top. It's a good example because the music is so transparent and you can really hear each melody joining the rest. Alright, back to Brahms. Let's listen to the development. It's a slower tempo, but the notes are definitely inspired on the themes of the exposition. And next there's actually a very clear example of this counterpoint that I talked about. There are two melodies being played by the violins at the same time. Try to distinguish the separate melody lines. And then the next big section is called the recapitulation. And you can see it as a sort of glorious memory, a reminiscence of the exposition. First, we hear a short part of the first theme, played by the brass section of the orchestra, and then the second theme, played by the violas and later the woodwinds. Now, because of all these interesting things that Brahms does to this music, we actually went away from the original minor key that the piece started in, and he moved on to a major key. So how does Brahms solve that? Because he actually needs to go back to this original key. He writes an amazing transition, which sounds very powerful, and again, it contains these variations on the original themes. He really is a master in using those same notes in the most unique ways. And not only notes, but also the rhythm is very clear here, and it kind of shapes the music. One rhythm that always comes back in this overture is the dotted rhythm, which sounds like this: pum, 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 pum. And it just makes the music sound sharp and powerful and lively. Let's listen to the transition. And again, we hear the hammer strikes, which means we are back in the dramatic minor key, the original key, and also in the last section, the coda. Honestly, there is not much to say about this last section, because it's basically a combination of everything I've said before. More variations and a constant reminder that we are back in the original key, the minor key. Before we hear that, I want to thank you for listening to this episode. And I really encourage you to listen to the full overture on its own, without me talking through it. Because it's one thing to talk and to learn about this kind of music, but listening really is an experience on its own. Here is the end of the piece. If you have any questions, feedback or suggestions, you can always comment them here below the video. And also make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you next week.